Okay, so all right, welcome you all to the new episode of Policy Dialogues, the Niti Samvad. So today we have got a special guest, which is Dr. Tom Pickerell. He is the director at the Global Ocean Program at the World Resource Institute. Tom has spent more than 20 years to protect our oceans, bridging the gap between marine science, sustainable fisheries, and real world policies. He worked with governments, NGO, industry stakeholders, and basically everyone over there who is involved into how we use and protect the sea. At World Resource Institute, he is leading on the projects of ocean-based climate solutions, sustainable seafood, and the global blue economy. He has also been involved with the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, helping shape international actions on the ocean health. Tom, it's great to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you want to add upon something which I have missed into your bio sketch?
No, I think it was very comprehensive.
Okay, so now let's start with the questions. So you have worked across science, policy, and industry. So can you recall one of the field movement that made you realize how badly policy can fail the oceans?
Absolutely, and there's many examples I can probably give, but I think one of the clearest examples was the early 90s was the collapse of the cod fisheries in the northwest Atlantic, so in the waters of Canada. These were fisheries that were so vast. People still thought up until the 70s that they were inexhaustible. You know, there was no way we could possibly even dent these fisheries. And yet, while the science was clear in the 80s, that the stocks were actually decreasing, that there was no politicians were listening. They were more listening to the fishermen and the catching sector representatives and the industry, that the science is wrong, the science is incorrect, there's loads of fish, trust us. And the fishery collapsed, and it still hasn't come back to this day, because we've seen a collapse in the ecosystem there, and we're not getting the recovery that you can get because we fished it so low. So that was a changing point to me, where you realise that, you know, the science is clear, but the science wasn't being followed, and unfortunately we still see that today in some examples.
So, like, you want to say that when the pragmatic approach has been followed by the policymaker, it is a more sustainable one.
Absolutely. And this is where the precautionary principle comes in. If you're unclear about something, then you be precautionary. You slow down, you take time, and you don't rush into things that could have an impact that maybe you're not aware of. But we haven't been doing that in many instances. We've been following either poor data, selectively choosing data, or just not listening to the science.
So, do you think that scientific temperament has always been into the last thing that the policy makers or the people at the policy table rely upon, and I think the popularism or whom does it pleases is their first goal? What is your take upon this?
Well, as a scientist, I was always shocked when the science wasn't given priority, because that's what we do. You know, the science says this, therefore we follow that. But when I worked for UK government, I realised that the science was only part of what influences decision making. And in fact, there's a super paper that came out maybe 20 years ago that shows that there are 22 different factors that impact political decision making, and the scientific evidence is but one of them.
Oh.
And there's things like, you know, the political party's view, there's the financing, there's obviously the socio-economic dimension, public opinion. There's so many different factors, and it made me realise that we can't just rely on the science. That has to be right, but there's other things we need to do. We need to win the hearts and minds battle. We need to highlight the impacts economically, socially, equitably. So that was a big waking point for me.
So what I can get from your whole conversation is that there are two S which matters: sentiment of the people as well as science.
Yes, and certainly the finances.
Yeah.
That's so
It's
important.
S, and F which matters. So moving on to the next question. So what are your top three stressors on marine ecosystem today? That we see that, you know, the policy could realistically change something if, I mean, in a time span, if we go on temporarily in the next 5 years, what do you think that are the major policy stressors?
And that's another great question. And I think the biggest stressor is climate change, but that's not something I think we can turn around in 5 years. So I'll put that to one side. Overfishing, that's definitely one of them. And that is something that can be addressed. And I think we could start to see changes within 5 years if we acted accordingly. When you see changes to fisheries management that are made based on good science, good management decisions and good monitoring and control and surveillance of fisheries, the stocks recover very quickly. So I think overfishing would be the first one. The second one tied to that is harmful subsidies. And this is where we're paying essentially for overfishing. Now the World Trade Organization have just reached an agreement with what we call Fisheries 1. Fisheries 2 is the second component of
Subsidy boxes.
That's right, yeah. So that would be one to remove as well. And I think that would be very quickly seen some positive changes. And the third one, I'd probably say plastic pollution. Now, I don't think plastic pollution is as much of a threat as climate change, for example, but it is something that we could see some positive changes in 5 years. And what would I suggest we do? Well, I think there's a number of different things, but one simple thing would be to have filters in washing machines to capture some of the fibres that come from clothing. So that at least we could see one pollution source restricted.
So I think the fibers that get into the ocean are some of the biggest problems nowadays, and which can be done by a smallest intervention possible, that is just install a filter.
Yeah, I think it would have a positive impact, probably more than banning straws.
Oh, so yeah, this is how, I mean, we forget upon the small things and we focus upon the large ones.
Yeah.
So, as you have also advised many governments and organizations for decades, can you just share an example of recommendation what made you got watered down and why?
Yes, many recommendations for marine protected areas have been watered down. So a marine protected area is an area of the sea that is it's delineated, so you have the boundaries for it, and activities are prohibited in that area. And it depends what the features are that you're trying to protect. So if you're protecting a coral reef, for example, in an area, then you would need to stop anything that's going to impact the seabed.
Okay.
So it's slightly different if you're trying to protect like a seabird or mammals. But the number of paper parks that we have is unbelievable. And if we actually look at the statistics on how many parks are, marine protected areas are actually protected, it's a fraction of the area that is meant to be protected. So this watering down has the effect of essentially removing any of the protections at all. So there's not one example I would give you really, because it's so widespread. So I think we need to actually protect marine protected areas, and that would be an area that if we did that, then we would see positive impacts both in the ecosystems but also in resilience of ecosystems in the face of climate change.
Okay, so that's interesting. Also, you mentioned something about plastics. Now, when it is plastic, I think we'll have to talk about microplastics also. So, microplastic is dominating the headlines nowadays, but not now, and also, but current policies proportions. It's a proportionate threat to the current policies. If we see, I mean, what 3 concrete policy actions that you think would push for the right now?
Yeah. So plastic pollution is definitely an issue that has got the sort of the public zeitgeist. People are not often aware of what's happening in the ocean. You know, it's out of sight. It's over the horizon. People only really see what's happening at the coast.
It's out of sight, but always in mind.
Yeah, I think that's it. And people see plastic on the beaches, in the water, and you can see images of plastic waste, and it's bad. People don't like to see that, so that's good. One of the challenges we have is that some of the ways that we're told to address it are based on our actions rather than actually solving the problem. So to give you an example here, at World Resources Institute, we like to work at a systems change level. So that's actually addressing the problem rather than addressing the symptoms. An example here would be, let's do a beach cleanup. So we'll go and clean the beach, remove the plastic waste, and we'll feel good, and the beach will look great.
Yeah.
But then tomorrow it will be covered in plastic because we haven't solved the problem of the plastic getting into the ocean. So a couple of things we need to do. We need to start looking at laws around single-use plastics. We're going to need single-use plastic for certain
I would
things.
like to proudly mention here that India has banned single-use plastics since 2022.
Yeah, and I think that we've got to look at doing that elsewhere. So that's important. I mean, there's still going to be some uses for single-use plastics, like in the medicine industry, for example. But we should restrict it down. We should be using more.
Biofilms are the alternative examples which
Yeah.
we can see that the plastic alternatives have been taken upon by biologically developed films which can be integrated into the human body, because microplastics have been greatly generated from the medical implant industries also. So that is one of
Absolutely, and that's got to be the second one. It's looking at alternatives like bioplastics from seaweed use. So that's definitely the other one. And the third area is actually recycling. It's that the reuse of plastics as well. How can we not just use them and abandon them? How can we actually get a life cycle approach to it, like we do with glass or aluminium, for example? So I think they're the three sort of key things that we can do to try to address the problem that we have. But the study came out very recently that even if we stop today, there will still be a problem in 100 years' time.
So I was also referring to a recent study which showed that a fish, which is not just only a part of your plate, it has many more industrial applications, and overall, a fish is not just about an organism of the ecosystem or the biological chain. So now let's move on to in oceans. We have looked upon how policies framework, what is now the plastic, and now the plastic has reached till the fish. So what fisheries policies often clash with local livelihoods, and where you have seen a model there successfully balance of conservation and the income generation, and what made it work?
Yeah, so there's always going to be a tension between users of the sea and conservation purposes as well. And I think that's something that we're getting better at realising. The 30 by 30 approach of protecting 30% of the both land and sea, I think is a good target to aim for. I mean, it's somewhat arbitrary, but it's good to have that sort of goal in mind. But that means that 70% is available for use. And so you have to manage that sustainably. One of the issues we have is with fisheries is that there are many users of the sea. So there's offshore wind, there's oil and gas, there's sediment dredging, there's leisure and recreation, and there's also huge competition between fishermen.
Yeah.
Static pots and traps and trawlers and dredgers. So there's a lot of challenges there, but it can be addressed. And one example I would give of a really good approach is in the Shetland Islands in Scotland. They have something called the Shetland Shellfish Order, which what they've done is they've drawn a line around the islands. These are islands off the very north of Scotland, 6 nautical miles. And the local community, including the fishermen, manage all the shellfish in that area. So they've taken on the responsibility. Yeah, so because they are now the stewards of it, they don't want to overfish. That's the first thing, because they're the beneficiaries. So because they're in charge of the management, they are they're very sensible about it, because it's the responsibilities on them. They also are able to close areas if they need to. They're able to open them up. They have sort of permit schemes, so they can manage the capacity. So I think this kind of local ownership is what makes it work. So you have a sense of stewardship. What doesn't work is when it's an open access and you have people coming in from other areas. They don't care if they overfish because they'll just move on.
Yeah.
So it's the local ownership is where you see real successes.
So adding upon to your point that the island at which we are shooting this podcast also is Mumbai. So Mumbai has been always an island of local fishermen communities called the Coolies. So Coolies is the biggest fishermen communities across the Indian coast. So we see that when we make, like as you rightly mentioned, that when the local stewardship is given and the protection of ocean is decentralized essentially, and I think that when these people feel as the trustee of the ocean and not the owner, so when we build, I think this trusteeship, which was also envisioned by our father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi ji, he also talked about this trusteeship where people are not owner of this earth, we are protector of this earth. So I think that is one of the point where we build upon such ecosystems where the local people have been given the whole prerogative to protect and to protect the oceans. Moving on to the next question, it is about the restoration projects. We see that the cryomesh technology, which is again now a very famous technology used for protecting the coral reefs. So the coral restoration nurseries and kelp farms are popular, but are they really scalable alternatives? And also, do they help, or it's again a policy distraction for the funders?
Yeah, I think these examples of restoration, small sort of localized restoration projects, are good overall. They have their positives. They raise awareness of the challenge. That's one thing they do very well. The second thing is they can have local benefits, which is very
Okay.
positive. In terms of scalability, it's unclear because a lot of the time the techniques that you're developing are very specific to the region. And there's also, again, it's the systems change. Are you dealing with the symptoms here, or are you dealing
With the cause.
With the cause? And I think that's something that we need to look at. And another example along these lines are hatcheries. There's lobster hatcheries that breed lobsters in captivity and release them into the sea.
Same as with the prawns also.
Yeah, and if we manage the fishery better, then we wouldn't need to do this. Though it may have local benefits, where you release them. So it's definitely not a negative. And I think what it does is it does increase ocean literacy if people are interested in these projects. So I think it's probably the answer to your question is yes and no. One concern you raise about funding is there is a limited pot of money in the ocean space, and in fact, Sustainable Development Goal 14, which is life under the water, is the least funded of all 17.
Life under the sea is also least funded.
Least funded by a huge factor.
Yeah, and that is the 71% of the earth.
Exactly. It's incredible how little funding we get. And so there is an argument that are these projects sort of taking money away? I don't know. I think it depends. I think they can have impact locally, and I think it's important to balance funding on local small-scale issues that may be scalable but are certainly useful locally with these global-scale challenges that maybe take a little bit longer to run. So it's probably yes and no.
So also now when we're talking about the navigability of the oceans, and we see that oceans have always been a part of disruption, whether it's the pirates or the Houthi rebels getting into your ships, and the people, those who claim the oceans. And India is one of the country which proudly claims, and we have various laws for that. UN clause on seas is one of them which guides our ocean policies and ocean claiming. So what do you think that when it comes to world as a whole, and where the resources have been shared alongside, we are sharing the same problems, we are also heading towards 2030, which will be again completion of the SDGs. So what do you think that navigability as a global problem, or you take it as that everyone has to protect their own seas?
I think there's a bit of both here. So we have obviously the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, notes that coastal and island communities have national waters out to 200 nautical miles,
200 nautical miles,
or the median line if you have a country next to you. And so those are under your national jurisdiction, and that means that you can work in a way that's a lot quicker than through the United Nations process or an international multilateral process. The work I do with the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, or the ocean panel, we work with 18 heads of state, and each of these 18 countries have committed to sustainably managing 100% of their national waters, which collectively makes up, these 18 countries collectively make up 38% of the world's national waters. So this is a significantly huge conservation activity. And it's also about generating a sustainable ocean economy. So it's not just about protection, it's about production and equitable sharing. But that leaves a lot of ocean not covered, and that's the high seas. So that's the area beyond 200 nautical miles.
Yeah.
Well, recently, just a couple of weeks ago, we managed to secure the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions Agreement, or the BBNJ Agreement, also known as the High Seas Treaty. And that talks about conserving and protecting biodiversity in these areas outside national waters. So a lot of work has got to be done now to actually implement that, and that will begin with a new COP, Committee of Parties, at BBNJ COP. I think the first meeting, the first discussions around that will be in January.
Yeah, COP 30, we are heading.
Yeah, so that's a great start for the high seas.
Okay.
And that's where we have to use multilateralism to actually protect these areas outside of national jurisdiction.
So yeah, that was also the next question. The high seas remain a governance grey zone. So should we treat them as a global park or a regulated commons? What concrete steps actually protect biodiversity there today? I think you have answered this question.
Well, there's
before
also,
asking.
before BBNJ, there was things called regional fishery management organisations.
Okay.
Because fisheries take place on the high seas.
Yeah.
And so these are bodies that are set up in particular areas to manage particular fisheries resources. So, for example, there are a number of tuna RFMOs.
Yeah.
There's one in the Indian Ocean, the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission. India, of course, is a member of that one. And it's all the countries that fish for tuna in that region.
In the high seas region.
That's
yeah.
right. And they come together and they manage in some cases better than others, manage the resources,
True.
the fisheries resources in those regional areas. So that happens already. And in some cases, we've actually seen tuna populations actually start coming up because they've done a good job. In other areas, we've seen poor decisions made and we've actually seen stocks decrease. So that exists at the minute, but many of them need to be reformed.
Okay, so now moving towards the carbon. Again, a buzzword of the ocean industry which has remained for quite long. Ocean is one of the largest carbon sequestration, the carbon sink in the world. So when we see that, ocean-based carbon solutions from seaweeds farming to geoengineering, this has gained a lot hype. Like you see any another policy talk, it is about how we are going to decarbonize oceans, because after all, the oceans have been a biological sink for years and years, and now the carbon has reached the upper limit where oceans are also unavailable to dissolve that carbon and cover it up. So what do you think that are the red flags that you tell in some most of PR than science?
Yeah, and you raise a really interesting point here about the ocean and climate change, because for many, many years we've viewed the ocean as a victim of climate change. And as you rightly say, the ocean absorbs carbon dioxide, and one of the consequences of that is it produces carbonic acid, which leads to the acidification of the seawater. And we've seen a drop from 8.2 to 8.1 pH, which doesn't sound much, but pH is on a logarithmic scale, so that's a huge drop.
Yeah.
And you just think how much carbon has to be absorbed to change the pH of the ocean. So it's considerable. But we've done research that looks at the potential of the ocean, both the ocean industries and the ocean itself. And if we were to implement these technologies that we already have, by 2050, we could contribute an emissions reduction of 14 gigatons of carbon emissions a year. Now, 14 gigatons, what does that mean? It's the same as the total emissions, that's everything, from the EU 4 times each year.
That's a quite big number.
It's incredible. So that's actually 35% of the emissions reductions needed to keep us to that 1.5 degrees centigrade target that even today, and the Secretary General of the United Nations said we're probably not going to meet that. So that's using existing technologies, and that includes things like decarbonising shipping, decarbonising the tourism sector, increasing the production of blue foods, conservation, so that's restoration, shifting away from offshore oil and gas. So there's 7 sectors, and they have varying contributions. So The other one is, to your point, is the marine carbon dioxide removal, and so that is one of the areas that there has got promise, but there's there is a lot of hype around it at the minute, and in fact we've done a report just recently that came out that called for better regulations around this, so that we're not misleading people or coming up with sort of fancy numbers, and we actually have a regulatory framework that enables it to be actually productive and clear.
Okay, so I think that now we are moving towards the end of the podcast, and the listeners are always tired of reduced plastic cliches. And you also mentioned that how that is not the solution, but it is just curing the symptom and not the cause. So, what three specific actions that could citizens and the coastal communities out there should take that will actually improve? I mean, because these people are also one of the stakeholders alongside the governments and the people at large, and India, where it promotes lifestyle for environment. And we have also seen that all the protesters and all the public outrage for the environment has not been for the environment, but that has been for the people displaced for the environment, or some or the other causes where, like in India, we see the examples of some of the local protesters or some of the global protesters, because we are fighting against climate change, not because it is affecting the community or the global ecosystem at large, but somewhere or the other there's an human centric anthropocentric approach. If we see in protecting the oceans also, we are not protecting oceans for the sake of protection of the fish, and but it is somewhere that we think that we are more superior to the nature, or as a human being we are more I think we should not take the pride of that, but we are on the top of the hierarchy of the ecological pyramid. So human thinks that human can protect everything and we can go on Mars also. So what do you think that what actions and some sustainable actions along with the policy framework that each of the person out there who's watching you should take, so that we can have some greater impact and we see that the oceans have been protected?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because what you don't want to do is sort of give people put the burden on the individuals themselves, particularly as they're probably not the ones who are causing the challenges in the first place. So
Yeah.
I think the first thing to do is to talk about it. So I imagine listeners to the podcast have got an interest in the ocean, but there's many people out there who don't, and they just aren't even aware of the challenges facing the ocean. So number one is talk. Talk to people about the challenges. Talk to people about what needs to change. So that's the first important thing. Get the message out there. Increase ocean literacy amongst your peers and your family and your friends. The second thing is to make your intentions clear. So we are represented by decision makers in government, in assemblies, and we need to tell them that this is an interest to me. I'm concerned about this. They may not be aware of it. They may share your concerns, but don't feel that that's something that's a priority for the voters.
We saw the 10 priorities in your paper also, which you mentioned.
Yeah. So that's another thing. Talk to people and talk to the decision makers and say, look, this matters to me, and I'd like you to represent my views and the views of other people. So that's two things there. The third thing is actually take action yourself. Now that doesn't, I'm trying not to make that contradict what I've said earlier about sort of systems change, but there are things that we can do locally. For example, if we're buying fish, we can try to avoid fish that we know are caught in an unsustainable way, and there's plenty of resources out there that can do that. And a lot of the time when you buy your fish at the market or in a supermarket or something like that, the people who are buying that fish for the marketplace, they're basing it on price. But if you tell them, I don't want this fish because it's got these challenges, then if enough people start to do it, it will change things. And we've seen that in the
we can see at the cost reduction also. The cost will be also reduced if the demand has been increased in generosity.
Exactly, that's right. It raises the scale. So there's a couple of things you can do, and I refuse to say stop using straws, because I think you can you use straw. My kids have got metal straws, that they use rather than plastic ones, and that's great. But I feel some way it takes the pressure off the people who really need to act.
Yeah. Okay, so by taking this message forward, and I think people will implement what Sir has said. First was the talk, change, acts to the policymakers, and to end with this, yes. Thank you for listening to us. It's Sahil Jadhav signing off today. Thank you.